Please turn with me to John chapter 11. We're going to be looking at perhaps a familiar story. And I think this is one that will show us a lot about who Jesus is, about his character, about why he came. And we may know those answers already. We may have read these stories and read the Gospels many times over, but let it be a good reminder, even if it's not the first time you've heard these things. And John here, he writes a little differently in his gospel than the other three. And the other three, they all four focus on various parts of Jesus' ministry, focus on his miracles, they focus on his life, his death, his resurrection. Some are a little more heavy on the parables, meaning Matthew, Mark, Luke, not John. John doesn't have a single parable, in which Pastor Brian just started that series on parables. And so we're going to be looking at the other three a lot. But this one, John, he writes a little different. And he doesn't give us a single one of those parables. And he's focusing on who Jesus is and why he came and where his authority comes from. I also think that John is writing a lot later than the other three. The other three were a lot closer to the time when Jesus lived and died and rose again, whereas John is writing much, much later, and many scholars actually put it at the time when John is exiled on that island that they would just send people to, essentially, to just wait out and die, so they didn't have to deal with them. And so possibly he's writing it then, which would put it around the 80s or 90s. And at this time, whenever John is writing, it appears that there's a lot of bad teaching, a lot of false teachings surrounding who Jesus is and why he came. So John's gospel is literally written to correct those teachings and to share the truth. And John really highlights two things throughout his entire book. And I may have cheated a little bit. So on the back of your outline, my dad, Pastor Brian, he went through John a few years ago, back in 2016. So you may notice that on the back of your outline it says outline from Pastor Brian. That's because I literally ripped that right from one of his messages and plopped it right in there because I didn't figure I could do much better for you. So in the two categories, he has them laid out there, that there's the 7 signs, which think miracles. That's John's word for miracles. And the 7 I am statements. And today we're going to look at the 7th sign and the 5th I am statement. Those are both in John 11. So if you haven't already, flip over to that back there and you can see them all just laid out. And these are the things that John that he wants to highlight. You know, he has the story about Jesus turning water into wine. And not just any wine, but good wine. So it's the best choice. We see that he healed the official's son, that Jesus has power over illnesses. We see healing the sick at Bethesda, superior to regulation and restriction. He does that on the Sabbath, and it kind of causes a little bit of a stir. He's got the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus has the power to create. John starts the gospel by telling us when Jesus was around, and it says, in the beginning. So Jesus has been there the whole time. Jesus is God. And so he has that same power to create that we read about in Genesis because he was there creating the world. We also see the miracle of walking on water. He's got power over nature. We see that in other gospels and other places, right, where he calms the storm, and all sorts of other things like that as well. We see the healing the sight of the blind man. He's got enlightening power. Enlightening, he gives sight to the blind. And then that last one, the last sign, raising Lazarus from the dead. Now, if I had to pick any of these that were pretty great, I might pick that one as the greatest. It's pretty awesome what he does here in John 11. Because Jesus has power over death. And then there's the 7 I am statements, and really I think these tell us who he is. The first one, I am the bread of life, which is cure for spiritual hunger. You know, we eat bread to sustain our bodies, and if he is the bread of life, then we don't eat him, but he is our cure for spiritual hunger, right? And I am the light of the world, source of understanding. I am the gate. He's the way to salvation. I am the shepherd, protector of salvation. Then there's that fifth one. I am the resurrection and the life. So he's the giver of life through belief in him. And then I am the way, the truth, and the life, provider of access to the Father. And I am the true vine, which is connection for fruitfulness. Now I know that's a bit of a long intro, but I think it's important to see that John is writing differently, and these are the things that he focused on in his entire gospel. And he writes a little differently than maybe we're used to from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it adds some depth to know that this miracle is intentionally placed the way that he did it, that it's intentionally in his gospel to show us something about Jesus. So let's dive into today's message, which is titled simply, Trust Jesus. In our first section, Trust Jesus through difficult times. And we see two things, that we need to trust Jesus in two specific ways, through suffering and through loss. And those are the points there on your outline. Starting in verse 1. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago, the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. So here we have this scene. Jesus is told about his friend, the one he loves, who is in the process of dying. And eventually Jesus, in this section, he makes the decision that he's going to go. He's going to go there. And we see that these first couple of verses has really some implications for Jesus. So Jesus is at the point of his ministry where he's just outright telling people who he is. In fact, Jesus is about to, with this miracle that he's about to perform in John 11, he's about to make it explicitly clear, if it hasn't been clear before, he's about to make it explicitly clear who he is. And now this thing that he's about to do is going to prove his power, that he has authority over sin and death, and it's probably going to make the headlines. People, including those who were trying to stone him just a few days prior, they're probably going to hear about this. They're probably going to hear that he's just simply in the area, because Jesus tended to have a crowd following him. So that means that if they know that he's in the area and they intend to do him harm, that there's chances are it's not going to go so well. There's going to be some suffering, both for him and for disciples, maybe his friends, for those around him, those who follow him. There's going to be some suffering. And Jesus makes the choice anyways to go. And of course, you can look ahead, and we know the rest of the story. A few days after this scene here in John 11 is when he celebrates the Last Supper, the Passover. And then the next day, he gets arrested, he's tried, he goes to the cross. So there's going to be suffering. It's a bit of a promise there that they're going to suffer, and he chooses to go anyways, and the disciples need to trust him. See, they said, well, why would you go there? You were literally about to be stoned, and Jesus is saying, trust me. So they need to trust him, even if it means that there's going to be suffering along the way. Now, the second thing we see in these verses, that we need to trust God through loss. Verse 11, after he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. And his disciples replied, well, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Notice Jesus knows at this point that Lazarus has died. The messenger only told him that he was sick, and Jesus knows that Lazarus is gone. He knew that he was going to die, and he knew what he was about to do next. And we see the disciples here, we see Mary, Martha, and others, that they simply need to trust Jesus, trust God's plan to restore and to renew our relationship with him. Because I think this is a picture of what is to come in the restoration and the salvation that we get through Jesus Christ. Now, if you're like me, I find certain things that Jesus says and does a little fascinating. And if you look at verse 14, that's a really fascinating statement. At first glance, it might seem like he's saying, well, I didn't really care if he lived or died. It doesn't really affect me. But then we get to see that Jesus is only glad because it gave him the opportunity to fulfill God's plan to reveal who he was. And so in the next section, since that statement seemingly makes it look like he doesn't really care, the next section is trust Jesus cares about our situation. And trust Jesus cares about sin, and know Jesus cares about brokenness. Starting in verse 17, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." And Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die." And here's that I am statement right there. I am the resurrection and the life. And Martha is going to, and already has, misunderstand his complete meaning here. She gets that Jesus is the Messiah. She believes that. She trusts in that. But she misses that he's saying he's literally going to raise Lazarus in this moment to physically prove his I am statement there. Verse 26, "And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Another thing that I find fascinating is both sisters said close to the exact same thing. And I think it's important to understand that Mary and Martha are making this statement, "If you had been here." And these were not and are not statements of frustration or anger, but instead strong statements of faith, knowing they knew that Jesus had the power to heal. They had seen him do miracles before. They knew it was possible, and they believed. What they missed was that he has power to not just heal, but to give life. Now, they're going to notice that here pretty soon. But let's go back to verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Now here is one of the, dare I say, one of the more famous verses in the Bible, John 11:35. You may have memorized it if you were in Awana like I. Sometimes you had a challenge to memorize a verse and you had to go home, and so you would tell your teacher, "Well, I'm going to memorize John 11:35. And yeah, it's the shortest verse in the Bible. But I think these two words, as simple as they are, these two words in this verse tell us a lot of things. Especially when we look at the context and we see where Jesus was at, what he's done, what he's going to do. And when we see it and we read it together with all the other verses and we see these two words, it tells us a few things. See, because Jesus wasn't crying because Lazarus was gone, that he was dead per se, because he knew what he was about to do. He knew he was about to restore Lazarus. But Jesus is crying because the effects of sin and death on the world that he created, that he was there in the beginning, the perfect world that he created, and sin entered in and broke that relationship that he had with his creation. The effects of that sin, that death, are on full display. They're in plain view in this moment. He can see the mourning, the suffering. Lazarus' literal tomb is right in front of him. And it makes him sad. It makes him cry. So sin's effects are obvious in this moment. And in this moment, he's so moved by the grief of the others that he cries himself as well. So not only does it show us that he cares about sin and about death, and that he mourns, he has to wait to fix it. It's not fixed all the way yet. There's still sin and death in our world. I think this shows us how much Jesus cares about his creation, about how much he cares and wants a restored relationship with his creation. The creation that he doesn't want to have to feel the horrible effects of sin. Fortunately, Lazarus' story doesn't end in verse 37. And Jesus makes a big statement with his actions here. So trust Jesus has power and authority to give life. And as I mentioned in the beginning, this is a big miracle. Probably one of his greatest. And now Jesus has raised people from the dead before, right? On a couple of different occasions. But they're not nearly this far dead. And now, how can you be more far dead versus others? I'm not going to comment on that. I think Princess Bride already commented on that, if you've watched that movie. But there is a few differences. One was within a couple hours, not much time for decay to set in, okay? One was within a day. Still not a lot of time for decay and the effects of death to take over that body. This one's different. It's been 4 days. And I haven't been to Israel, but I've seen lots of pictures. I know it's a dry and arid place. And when things sit out in the baking sun, they don't tend to do so well. So a body sitting in a tomb, even in a cool, dry tomb, for 4 days wouldn't have been so good. The effects of death would have been very evident on Lazarus' body. So in this next section, we see Martha noticing that it's been 4 days and hesitating to trust Jesus in his power and his authority. And let's be honest, we might have hesitated too. So don't hesitate facing Jesus' power. It's that next point there. Verse 38, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" See, Martha hesitates to obey Jesus. She knows that he's the Messiah. She knows that Lazarus is going to resurrect again someday. She knows that Jesus can do miracles, but in this moment, death was a little too real. It seemed too much to overcome. Because Lazarus' body had plenty of time to decay, especially in that tomb in that dry and arid desert. Logically, Jesus' request to open the tomb doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And Jesus' response was beautiful. He simply reminds Martha to believe. And at this they change, they obey, they recognize Jesus as that authoritative figure, and they trust him. So they recognize Jesus' authority. And in verse 41, so they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Jesus literally calls out Lazarus, and the man up and walks out of the tomb. Not just a trick, not a puppet, not a ghost, but really alive. And this miracle or sign, as John calls them, proves that Jesus has the same authority over life and death as God the Father. This action is a bold statement that says Jesus is God and has the same power and authority as such. See, Lazarus was decaying physically. He'd been decaying for 4 days, which is a great representation of our sinful state. See, we're decaying in sin, and we need someone to help us fix it. Lazarus was stuck in his position. He was dead. He couldn't do anything about it, just like we are stuck in our sin, and we can't fix it ourselves. And Lazarus, he needed an external source to act upon him to change his state. And we need someone to step in and act on our behalf and take our punishment for us. And I included a quote on your outline so you can follow along with me about this very same topic, about why Jesus did this and what it means. And it says, the sister's Jewish friends could only sympathize and weep. It took Christ to give the man life. How did Christ give him life? By the power of his word. Why did Christ raise Lazarus? Because he loved him and because it brought glory to God. This is why he has saved us. We deserve to die and go to hell, but because of his great love, he rescued us. And this leads us to our last section on the outline. Believe Jesus is the life giver and redeemer. And in these two verses, we're going to see the two responses to this event, this happening. And the first response is accept Jesus. Verse 45, therefore many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. There it is, simple. Choose to accept Jesus. Accept him as your life-giving Redeemer, your personal Savior. Accept him. And then the second response is to reject Jesus. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. And when they tell the Pharisees then start immediately plotting to kill Jesus. Because those people were, think of them kind of like informants, informing the Pharisees on what Jesus had done and the religious leaders, because they didn't fully trust him. They didn't fully accept Jesus, and they chose to reject him. Which one are you? Are you choosing to trust in Jesus as your life-giving Redeemer? Or are you like those who went and reported to the Pharisees? And we get the sense here that the ones who went and reported didn't do so happily, like, oh, look what Jesus did. Be happy, be glad. It was more of the opposite of that. They weren't excited, they weren't happy. So our question there at the bottom of the outline is, do I trust Jesus as sovereign over my whole life? Meaning, do I trust Jesus with everything that I am, including my life now, my future death, and then the resulting afterlife, which then brings into salvation? Because see, Jesus being fully God and fully man, it gave him the power and the authority over sin and death. Raising Lazarus was a beautiful display that revealed Jesus to be God and capable of some pretty awesome things. So then, if Jesus really is God, then we can simplify most of today's message to literally just 2 words. And I did that on purpose because of John 11:35. And those 2 words are just to simply trust Jesus. Will Andy and Dante come and prepare the communion table for us? Now, John 11 fits beautifully with communion. Because when we celebrate the Lord's table, we're remembering Christ's sacrifice and his defeat over sin and death at the cross. And we see a glimpse of that power and authority. Oops, that was me. We see a glimpse of that power and that authority in various other scriptures, including right here in John 11. See, right after raising Lazarus from the dead, Jesus spent some time in that same area. For the next several days, he was in Bethany and eventually enters into Jerusalem. And just a few short days later, after raising Lazarus from the dead, he's hanging on the cross, dying for our sins. That's what we remember when we come to the Lord's table. And Jesus proved who he was. He proved he had that power and that authority when he did miracles like raising Lazarus from the dead.